nosotros, y yo creo que esto ha sido una meta que nos propusimos desde el principio, fue cómo involucrar al mercado de capitales en los proyectos de infraestructura. Es un proceso difícil, todos sabemos, digamos, que dada, digamos, el punto donde está la industria y donde estaba el sector, pues ese cruce no era fácil. Desde el principio, nuestro primer esfuerzo fue lo que empezamos a hacer el año pasado, cuando arrancamos en forma a buscar mecanismos, fue enfocarnos primero en lo que considerábamos la forma más fácil para la industria para entrar, que era el tema de la refinanciación de los proyectos. Claramente, entrar a financiar los proyectos en su fase de operación, y creemos que ese va a ser un rol fundamental del mercado institucional, es la refinanciación de los proyectos de infraestructura cuando estén en esa fase de refinanciación. Ya lo han hecho en algunos proyectos, pero el bloque grande del programa, el bloque grande de proyectos que van a ir a los mercados, pues no lo van a empezar a ver sino de aquí a 4, 5, incluso más años. Y eso nos generó a todos, y lo digo todos, incluido la misma industria, conversaciones que he tenido con muchos de los presidentes de los fondos, de las compañías incluso de seguros, pues había la sensación de que se iban a sentar a esperar aquí 4 o 5 años a que realmente el mercado de capitales pudiera tener un rol importante. Pues lo estaban haciendo en forma indirecta a través de financiar los bancos, pero en forma directa los proyectos pues parecía difícil que los inversionistas institucionales pudieran entrar. Por eso empezamos a trabajar, y desde el año pasado hemos venido trabajando, mirando toda la experiencia internacional. Una de las razones por las cuales nosotros contratamos a Daniel Bond, una persona que de paso, para los que no lo conocen, Daniel viene de una carrera muy interesante, digamos, desde empezando en el Exim Bank de Estados Unidos, en los temas de financiación de proyectos, ha pasado por toda una serie de experiencias, tal vez una de las más importantes para nosotros, por la cual lo contratamos con el apoyo, de aquí valga la pena la propaganda, el apoyo del Banco Mundial y los programas de mercado de capitales del Banco Mundial, pues fue su larga experiencia en uno de los monoliners o compañías de seguros especializadas que fueron críticas, digamos, en los 90s y parte de la década pasada, en llevar al mercado de capitales a participar muy activamente en infraestructura. Desafortunadamente es una industria que tuvo una crisis de calificación, en parte causada por haberse involucrado, en mi opinión equivocadamente, en el negocio de la subprime de vivienda en los Estados Unidos, que llevó a que la mayoría de estas compañías las bajaran la calificación y por tanto salían del negocio. El negocio de ellas eran ser empresas de AAA Estados Unidos y subían los proyectos de grado de inversión, los subían a grados de inversión y permitieron que el mercado de capitales entrara de fondo en forma muy importante en todas partes del mundo, y particularmente en América Latina. En Chile fue un gran ejemplo de cómo los fondos de inversiones entraron en forma grande, cerca de 5 billones invertidos por fondos de inversiones chilenos en infraestructura en los 90 fue gracias a los monoliners. Desafortunadamente, pues los monoliners básicamente casi desaparecen, ahorita están empezando a recuperarse. Y Daniel, que estuvo con ellos, después se volvió consultor y ahorita está participando en uno de estos monoliners que están tratando de revivir. Por eso su experiencia en nosotros era vital, porque era tratar de capturar una experiencia muy valiosa que hubo en los 90 y parte de la década pasada, en cómo se logró traer al mercado de capitales de infraestructura. Entonces, esa fue una de las, y por eso lo invitamos hoy, dado que él venía en el proyecto que tiene con nosotros, pues queríamos que pudiera también compartir mucha de la experiencia que él ha tenido, y en el proyecto que él tiene con nosotros, parte de lo que se le pidió era que miraran lo que estaba pasando en el mundo. La verdad es que Colombia en este aspecto sí está a la vanguardia. Colombia está haciendo lo que están haciendo todos los países desarrollados. Nosotros en eso no estamos 10 años atrás, estamos en el momento haciendo reflexiones, mirando experiencias, lo que están haciendo los europeos, los asiáticos, lo que está haciendo América Latina, lo que está haciendo Estados Unidos, para que realmente nuestro interés ha sido aprender de lo que se está haciendo con éxito en otras partes del mundo, pero en muchos países del mundo se está experimentando, y parte de la razón es porque los bancos durante muchos años, básicamente los últimos 20 o 30 años, dominaron el negocio de financiación de proyectos en el mundo. Sin embargo, los bancos, dado la crisis de final de la década pasada, los bancos perdieron en muchos casos su capacidad importante de prestar al sector, y eso ha llevado a que el mercado institucional en el mundo se está volcando a ser un gran jugador de financiación de infraestructura. incluso desde el principio de la fase de construcción. Entonces, lo que estamos mirando nosotros es exactamente lo que están mirando todos los países desarrollados, por razones diferentes. Nosotros venimos de no haber hecho mucho, pero por tener un programa tan grande necesitamos tener unos jugadores como el mercado institucional participando desde el principio. El resto del mundo, porque los bancos se salieron o se redujeron sustancialmente su participación y necesitaban que alguien tomara ese espacio, y lo están tomando los mercados institucionales. Por esa razón, pues nosotros empezamos a trabajar estructuras. Ustedes han oído, digamos, de los medios y seguramente algunos que han participado en algunos de los foros, hemos estado mirando varias estructuras, desde emisión de bonos, digamos, día cero, con unas garantías muy fuertes que permitan de alguna manera reproducir un poco lo que hacían los monoliners, reduciendo sustancialmente los riesgos de construcción y llevando las emisiones a un grado de inversión alto, digamos. Eso lo estamos mirando, lo hemos estado mirando. Hay un tema de costos, no hemos podido realmente todavía necesariamente llegar al producto ideal, pero lo estamos discutiendo también con los concesionarios que se ganaron las primeras, y de pronto tenemos la sorpresa que podamos hacer una primera emisión en este paquete de la primera ola, pero si no, nuestra meta sí es para la segunda ola poder llegar con instrumentos. Dado las dificultades que estábamos viendo, digamos, el tiempo que iba a tomar este proceso, empezamos a mirar un segundo canal, una segunda idea, que era la posibilidad de alguna manera de puentear esa falta de capacidad técnica que tenían los institucionales en el tema de infraestructura. Y siguiendo un poco los pasos de lo que fue la experiencia de los fondos de capital privado en Colombia, que fue también una forma de llevar a la industria institucional a financiar proyectos que no estaban en el mercado, que no eran listadas, que eran compañías que estaban en fases iniciales o estaban consolidándose, y por lo tanto la forma de poder dar acceso a los institucionales a esa toma de riesgo de proyectos, en ese caso mucho más riesgosos, pero de tamaño más pequeño, la idea de tener un administrador con conocimiento, que era el gestor, personas con conocimiento que le pudieran de alguna manera puentearle a los institucionales esa falta de know-how que tenían en esos temas, y darle la oportunidad de tener acceso a ese activo, un activo de mucho más riesgo. Nos llevó a pensar que podíamos hacer algo similar en el tema de deuda, y lo podíamos hacer para la infraestructura. Y por eso surgió la idea de crear los fondos de deuda para infraestructura, que estábamos, yo creo que abanderando en muchas partes del mundo de este esfuerzo. Hay otros países que lo han empezado, pero es un tema bastante reciente en el mundo. Pero es un proceso creciente y exitoso, porque precisamente por la misma razón que les mencioné antes, por la salida de los bancos de forma importante, los institucionales encontraron que los fondos de deuda eran un mecanismo, no el único, pero un mecanismo importante, sobre todo un mecanismo para arrancar mucho más idóneo, porque les daba la tranquilidad de ir de la mano de gestores especializados, gente con experiencia, gente con capacidad de gestionar el crédito, porque es que el riesgo que tiene hoy en día prestar en un proyecto no es solamente hacer el análisis inicial para poder tomar la decisión de invertir, sino es todo el mantenimiento de la operación del proyecto, donde pueden surgir muchas cosas. En 25 años de concesión o en un crédito de 20 años pueden pasar muchas cosas, y tener gente en capacidad de tomar decisiones con conocimiento y con experiencia, que cómo actuar para manejar situaciones que se van a presentar, y siempre se van a presentar situaciones, que eso es imposible que no se presenten, pero tener a alguien que tenga experiencia haciendo eso, como gente que ha tenido experiencia en bancos, gestionando lo mismo. Los bancos viven permanentemente gestionando situaciones como esa, y las manejan, y logran salir adelante. Entonces tener administradores con ese conocimiento para nosotros lo vimos como un canal muy importante para poder atraer a los inversionistas institucionales, porque era la forma de darles entrada al tema del riesgo de construcción, pero de la mano de gente que sabía del tema, en unos montos limitados, porque obviamente la regulación permitió pero como lo permitió dentro de unos límites del 5% de los portafolios, y porque consideraba que era importante que lo hicieran, pero que no fueran a hacer montos demasiado grandes que pudieran, digamos, elevar el riesgo del portafolio como un todo. Por eso nosotros hemos estado muy detrás de este programa, de este proyecto. Digamos, empezamos desde la misma sacada de la norma el año pasado al surgimiento de los primeros fondos. Hemos estado acompañando a todos los administradores, varios de los cuales están acá sentados, digamos, que han estado desde el principio muy involucrados tratando de empujar esto. Creo que estamos llegando ya al punto, espero muy pronto, de arranque de estos fondos. Y es importante además que sea pronto, porque ya la primera ola, nosotros estamos, todos los bancos y nosotros estamos ya empezando a negociar con los concesionarios pues lo que van a ser la estructura de financiación de cada una de las concesiones. La estructura de financiación pues va a variar dependiendo del proyecto, va a haber una gran diversidad, pero honestamente vamos muy bien, hay mucho interés, pero me parece una oportunidad que es una oportunidad grande de que estos fondos no pueden empezar entrando con algunos de nuestros proyectos de la primera ola. Y por eso nosotros como financiera, la semana pasada tomó la Junta la decisión de participar en los fondos, digamos, de apoyar los fondos incluso con equity en los fondos, pues con inversión como un inversionista, pero con el ánimo de acompañar el proceso nuevamente. Son administradores muy capaces todos, sin embargo, nosotros creemos que podemos apoyar aún más ese esfuerzo, siendo nosotros también partícipes como inversionistas del fondo, y esperamos que esto pronto también acelere, digamos, las decisiones de los institucionales que están evaluando y han estado evaluando esta iniciativa. Yo creo que por lo tanto estamos arrancando bien. Todos los concesionarios tienen una banca de inversión muy sólida, estamos trabajando, todos los proyectos están avanzando muy bien, todas las 9 concesionarias ubicadas están avanzando muy bien en su proceso, pero por eso es tan importante que ustedes puedan tener la oportunidad de empezar a entrar, digamos, en esta primera ola a través de la posibilidad de entrar a los fondos. Pero es que ya pues simplemente resaltar la importancia que tiene este trabajo, que tiene este esfuerzo y la importancia que tienen ustedes, digamos, como inversionistas institucionales en la financiación del programa. Entonces es un programa muy grande, muy ambicioso, y va a haber mucho más, digamos, yo creo que vamos a seguir en este proceso por muchos años, y es muy importante, dado nuestra propia capacidad de nuestro sistema, de que todas las fuentes puedan ser utilizadas de la forma más eficiente posible, y que ustedes pueden ser un jugador, son un jugador, puede que no sean el líder, digamos, en esta primera fase, van a ser líderes realmente en la organización, pero pueden empezar y a tener un rol importante también en esta primera fase, y yo creo que hay todo el interés de la industria, todo el interés nuestro de apoyar eso, de todas las multilaterales, todo el mundo realmente está impulsando esta iniciativa, y por eso este taller de hoy, que espero sea también un espacio para, no solamente para que oigan y aprendan sobre lo que está haciendo el resto del mundo, un poco oigan de parte de digamos, toda la experiencia de lo que se ha venido haciendo, y porque de alguna manera sí estamos nosotros hoy en el mismo nivel en que están muchos los países desarrollados, buscando formas de atraer inversión institucional, infraestructura, pero que lo estamos haciendo con gente con conocimiento, con mucha experiencia, para que esto salga bien, para que todo nos salga bien. Entonces, pues yo espero que esta conferencia, que será una de varias conferencias que vamos a estar organizando con expertos en estos temas, digamos, para que ustedes también se beneficien, también dentro de un ejercicio que hemos venido haciendo con todos los 4 gremios de la industria del sistema financiero. Hicimos convenios con todos, digamos, para apoyar este trabajo de fortalecimiento institucional, sobre todo fortalecimiento de capacitación. Vamos a hacer más cosas, estamos lanzando. Y ahorita yo asumo que Paola en algún momento les va a contar sobre, al final de la conferencia, ya estamos lanzando la especialización en Project Finance en la Universidad de los Andes, que arranca, ¿ahora cuándo arranca? El 3 de marzo arranca, es una especialización bien interesante, digamos que yo espero que algunos de ustedes puedan participar, porque nos interesa realmente llevar a la industria a elevar los estándares de Project Finance, pero para eso necesitamos que todos los actores de la industria, todos, digamos, todos los niveles se involucran muchísimo más en este tipo de financiación, que definitivamente es diferente a la forma como se va a financiar. Pues con esto pues quiero darle la bienvenida a Daniel, y darle la palabra para que pues arranque con su presentación. Lo que vas a hacer en inglés, ¿cierto? O sea que espero que no haya ninguna limitación de parte de nadie, digamos, desafortunadamente no tenemos traducción simultánea, pero yo espero que, y si hay preguntas y eso, pues mire, tanto Paola, Francisco, todo el equipo, incluso el equipo de la IFC y del Banco Mundial que están acá, me pueden ayudar de traductores. Si hay preguntas, no se cohíban por el hecho de que no se presentan como hacen en inglés, pueden hacer en español y se traduce y se lo traducen a Daniel para que la sesión sea interactiva y ustedes puedan preguntar cualquier duda que tengan sobre la presentación. Muchas gracias. Vamos a quedar un ratico, oír un ratico la presentación y después pero los dejo en muy buenas manos. Muchas gracias.
Is the microphone working?
No.
I can speak up until the microphone starts, and I'll stand up because I can see you better. You can probably see me better. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate all of you coming out. This is a great group of people. I expect this is a large part of those who will make this wonderful pipeline of infrastructure projects in Colombia come into existence. I started working almost a year and a half ago now as a consultant, part-time consultant to FDN, largely to bring some of the experience in the rest of the world in project finance and see how it might be applied here in Colombia. And that's what you'll hear today, is a lot about what is happening in other places and how it can be translated perhaps here in Colombia into being effective. But let me tell you that Colombia is on the leading edge. It's beginning to get a lot of international attention. It probably has one of the best pipelines of infrastructure projects in existence in the world today. That is, a lot of projects that are going to be... Did you take it off? There's a switch, there's a on switch, I guess. How's it working? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And while you're here, just to make sure I can get the... There we go. Okay, I think we've got the technology solved now, hopefully. Colombia, while you can learn from the rest of the world, you will be teaching the rest of the world very soon. And I say that in all honesty because you're trying to do something that is really being attempted in many other countries around the world. That is basically to bring in the long-term investors, the institutional investors, the pension funds, the life insurance companies, and other types of investors who have a long-term horizon into infrastructure finance. And this is a very big theme in Europe and North America, Australia, and Asia today. There have been some interesting innovations. There has been some success. But the golden grail is to get infrastructure investors into the financing from day one, alongside the banks in many cases, or even without the banks, in financing large-scale infrastructure projects. And there is no country in the world that has completely solved this issue, has really brought in the institutional investors into this market. There's a feeling, there's an opinion that it's an ideal match, that institutional investors are perfectly suited to infrastructure investments. But to make that match work, there are many impediments. And that's where the innovation comes in, and the financing and the education, and getting people to understand the benefits of infrastructure finance and how to overcome the impediments. This workshop today, and I hope it will be a workshop and not just a lecture, although you'll probably find I can talk for hours. I hope that you'll talk to, ask questions. Don't hesitate to interrupt me. Terminology, I know, can be a stumbling block. Sometimes I will say something that, in my audiences, normally people understand, and is used in a completely different way here. We had a discussion with the World Bank about the word securitization and what it meant. And it means different things in different parts of the world. So if you need to just stop me and say, well, what do you mean by that phrase or by that term, please do so. And I will give you an idea of what we're going to go through. I promise I don't have hundreds of slides. I think I have 15 slides. So there's There's some relief here. The slides are just there to pace me and to make sure I cover certain topics and for illustrations in some cases. But I would like to have this be a discussion. And I'll tell you that I'm learning every time that I have meetings here in Colombia a great deal. And that's very important for the job that I'm trying to do, because Colombia is different from Australia and Canada and Europe and the United States. You have different regulations, you have a different institutional investor structure here than in other countries. And while there are similarities, there are important differences. And that will mean Colombia can't just pick up something from another country and say, we'll do that just like they did it. It just will not work, I expect. You can learn from other countries, but it has to be translated into something that works for you. And there's a real challenge there. And so as I learn more about Colombia, I can do my job better about lessons from abroad and how they can be brought to Colombia, and talking to the FDN staff how they can use these lessons. Today we'll be discussing institutional investors and infrastructure financing. That's sort of the general, broad area. I'm going to cover sort of three basic topics. The first two I think we'll get through fairly quickly, and then we'll probably focus on the last. The first one is the advantages of investing in infrastructure debt. Now, I'm emphasizing debt because we're going to focus on debt, not equity. Then the impediments. Why can it be very difficult at times for you as a pension fund, say, to add infrastructure debt to your portfolio and make it into an asset class eventually? And then finally, various approaches to overcoming the impediments. There are various avenues to invest in infrastructure, and we want to discuss those and sort of the pros and cons of the different approaches that you can take. Now, globally, institutional investors have not invested heavily in infrastructure. There's a tremendous literature in recent years about the potential for that happening, but it really has not happened anywhere in great degree. On average, if you were to look at institutional investors' portfolios, you would only find about 1% of direct infrastructure assets in those portfolios. It's very small. In some countries, there's none. In other countries, there's some. In a few countries, like Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, you may get up to 2% or 3% on average. If you look at individual institutional investors, however, there are some pension funds that are getting up to 10% of their assets into infrastructure, but there are very, very few of those. And in most cases, they are very large pension funds who started investing in this asset class 2 decades ago and have finally built up to, say, 10% of their assets in infrastructure. Now, when I say that there's a lot of interest in getting infrastructure financed by institutional money, that interest is coming largely from the project sponsors or from the governments who are sponsoring these projects. But it's also coming because the banks, which used to be the primary source of infrastructure financing, are finding it more difficult to continue as they did in the past. And that has to do with new bank regulatory requirements, Basel III in particular for the European banks. It's more difficult then to commit to a long-term investment when they're short-term funded primarily. It's the mismatch, the maturity mismatch that's gotten a lot of attention from regulators and has made it more difficult, more expensive for them to provide the financing. That's one reason. Another reason, and this is very pertinent to Colombia because your banks are not nearly as restricted in this respect, is the magnitude of infrastructure financing needs. There's no country in the world today that I think feels like they have the infrastructure they need, the basic infrastructure. The highways, the ports, the airports, the schools, the hospitals. So everywhere you turn, there's an infrastructure gap. There's a need for more financing to fill that gap. And there's a realization that there's a limit to the ability of the banking sector alone to fill that gap. And if you look around for where is the money, and of course there's lots of money in the world, we don't have a shortage of money, especially after so many countries have gone through quantitative easing. The shortage is investments that money is willing to go into. So there is a need to find the assets that can fill this gap, and if you look at where these assets are, it's in the institutional investors, the pension funds and the insurance companies primarily. So there's a big push to increase investment. There has been a significant increase in such investment, but so far, the bulk of this, rather surprisingly, has been in equity rather than in debt. And I say surprisingly because institutional investors, pension funds and insurance companies in particular, are conservative investors. They cannot take large risk. They need to have safe, secure, well-earning investments to make sure that future generations are taken care of. They're looking to take care of people's needs in the future. So it is rather surprising that it's in equity rather than debt that you have found the most growth in terms of investment in infrastructure, because equity is naturally riskier, even in infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying that equity investment in infrastructure is risky. It's not. It's a pretty good, safe investment. But what's surprising is that they've gone much faster in the equity area than in the debt area. And I think there's some reasons for that that have to do with sort of the starting point that we had when institutional investors started looking at getting into infrastructure. It was equity debt rather than debt management firms that were available. It was the Macquaries of the world that were beginning to mobilize institutional investors to get into infrastructure, and they chose to go the route of equity investment because that was what they were working in primarily. However, there is now appearing much more investment into debt. And that is needed because if you look at any infrastructure project and the balance of the debt versus the equity, you see most of the financing is debt. It's not equity. You know, the typical percentages are, say, 80% debt, 20% equity. So, of course, that means there's greater need for the debt component than the equity component. So the opportunities are even greater to invest through debt than to equity. Now, this is just sort of starting out a little bit of background framework. We're not going to talk about equity investing, but it's important to understand what has gone on up until now. In the equity area of investing, it's gone through two routes, basically in the public stock of infrastructure companies primarily, in some cases stock in projects, or through a direct investment in projects with equity, just putting equity directly into projects. And that has been managed primarily by infrastructure stock funds or direct private equity or mutual fund type investments. And that's where you've seen most of the activity, in those types of mechanisms for investment. Now we're going to focus on the debt side. And here there are two major routes again. You can go through the capital market side, publicly issued bonds and traded, or you can go through private debt, that is investing directly into the projects without the issuance of project bonds. For example, a bank loan, or even a pension fund making a direct loan to a project. And you have various instruments that have been used under each of these categories. It's interesting, people forget about the fact that government infrastructure bonds have for a long time been the major way that infrastructure projects have been financed. Although oftentimes they weren't designated as infrastructure specific. There was not earmarking of the proceeds for infrastructure. They were simply government bonds. And the government raised money through bonds and then allocated a portion of it to infrastructure. And that still is the major route globally. is for infrastructure to be financed through bonds, but bonds issued by the governments. Corporate bonds, simply, you have corporations, construction companies, or others that invest themselves into infrastructure, and you can buy their bonds. So that's an indirect route. We're not going to deal with those two categories. We are going to focus on project bonds. This is normally where you have a project organized with a special purpose vehicle, and you have a non-recourse financing structure. And bonds are issued based on the performance of the project itself, not on the creditworthiness of the project sponsor, because you don't have very much recourse to the project sponsor. The project sponsor is very important, but you don't go to them for payment. You look to the project sponsor to make sure the project performs, and your payment is based upon the performance of the project. So we are going to talk about project bonds, because that's an important step, and is a step that will occur here in Colombia. There are already some project bonds. There's going to be a lot more project bonds, we hope. On the other side, private debts, you can again loan to the companies that essentially then invest in infrastructure, and we're not going to talk about that, but we are going to talk about project loans directly. And one of the vehicles, and this is mislabeled, it shouldn't say infrastructure bond fund, it should say infrastructure debt fund. You can go through an infrastructure debt fund as a vehicle for either of these ways of investing. That you can have a fund invest in project bonds, you can have it invest in project loans, you can actually have the invest in company debt indirectly into infrastructure. So that gives you some background. Now, why is that important to begin to separate these categories out? This graph shows very clearly that infrastructure funds in general, this is both debt and equity, we don't have much history. You can really see that before 2004, they really didn't exist. There were a few. The Macquarie funds were the early ones. But they were isolated. There was very little done through these funds. The growth has been since 2004. After the global recession, it dropped, or during the global recession, it dropped and is beginning to pick up again. This last 2014 is just the first quarter, so it should be discounted. So there has been a tremendous growth in investment through funds. And we're going to talk a lot about investment through infrastructure funds. But if we look at just debt funds, there was very, very little done before 2006, and then afterwards it has grown. This number is the number of individual funds, and this is the amount of funding raised by them. And what you find if you look at that and compare it to the previous graph, the scale is quite different. It only represents 15% of the number of funds, and only 12% of the capital raised. Now, I emphasize this for an important reason. There's a large amount of...
Daniel, is this global?
This is globally. Yeah, globally. Now these are some of these are nationally focused, some are globally focused, but this is a global total. And if you go back to the previous, if you look at the scale here, it's 0 to 12 billion. And over here it's 0 to 60 billion. So they're not on the same scale. So if you were to take, this is debt and equity, if you were to segregate it out, debt would be down here, 12%. Now, when you first start hearing about infrastructure investment, most of what you're hearing are from people who have put together or have observed infrastructure equity funds. And that means most of what you have in terms of a performance record and knowledge and structures is basically based upon equity investing. But it's amazing how rarely people will make that clear. They'll talk about infrastructure investing as if it doesn't matter. if you're investing equity or debt. They just lump it all together. And they make various claims about it as to the attributes of this type of investing. Well, in reality, the attributes are very different between equity and debt. And you should be keenly aware of that difference anytime you're hearing about the advantages or the experience, whether or not it is equity or debt first. And then you should find out even more what type of equity, what type of debt, which region, which type of project. Because there are many, many different distinctions that can be made, and they're quite different performance characteristics and different results. And it has tremendously confused everybody. In reality, we have to be honest, even though I'm promoting infrastructure debt, you might say here, that we don't have a track record. If almost everything that has been done just with the debt funds started back in 2006, and you know how slow it is to catch up and start recording and having results reported, we don't have much of a track record to go on. But we do have the ability to analyze. And here's that caveat. Most of the infrastructure financing has been in the form of equity, and much of what is said and known is about equity, not debt. But what do we know about equity and debt? Here's the basics. This is what we know about equity and debt. Now this is a graph, let me make sure that you understand what we're doing, of a project's financing. And I start at year 6, assuming that you're through construction, you're into the operations and maintenance phase, you're getting regular availability payments or market payments, say toll roads, collecting tolls, or getting availability payments. And of course, the revenue from a project should be fairly stable. In most cases, a lot of infrastructure projects have a monopoly position. They're highly regulated. There's not a great deal of risk, and so their total revenue is rather stable. But out of that total revenue, you always have to first pay for your operations and maintenance before you provide any return to debt or equity. And so the curved line at the top is a hypothetical net revenue after operations and maintenance. And the reason from the year 6 to the year 25 you might have these ups and downs is that infrastructure ages. It has to be repaired. Like if you have a road, you have periodic, every few years you'll have to pay a lot more out of the cash flow to say repave or put in new toll booths or things like this. So you do have a steady revenue stream, and the reason why it's going up is it's usually linked in some way to inflation, either directly or indirectly. So the revenue is rising and it's steady. That's typical of inflation of basic infrastructure projects. The net revenue is not so steady. It goes up and down. Now, after you've paid your operations and maintenance, you then pay debt service for the senior debt. And usually the waterfall is, let's say you just have debt and equity, is you pay the debt first, and then you pay the equity payments. And the debt payments are contracted. That is, you have a promise that you will be paid a certain amount of interest on the outstanding principal, and in many cases you have repayments of principal. They can be steady, they can be periodic, or they can be deferred, but it's a contracted amount that comes out of the cash flow. And that should be quite stable. So you have some instability introduced by the differences in maintenance cost. Then you take out the payments to debt, and since you're highly leveraged, 80% debt to equity, what's left over goes to equity. So this is your equity stream that you can expect by a normally operating project. So it's large here, then it gets squeezed, and it grows, and it gets squeezed, and it grows. That's not a stable income stream. So there's a great difference between the returns you get from debt versus equity. With debt, really the focus is right here. When that line dips so low that it dips below having enough to pay debt service obligations, that means you have a default. Unless you have some protection against that default, say by a liquidity facility or a credit guarantee. Just looking at the project itself, it's an event of default. So while equity has a very variable return, debt is yes or no. Yes, I'm being paid what I was contracted. I knew what it was going to be. I don't get anything extra, usually. I get my normal payments. It's very predictable, and it's quite safe. And occasionally, you might have a shortfall where you have a debt service interruption. Now, in reality, even those are not a huge problem, because projects have a great ability to recover after having a failure to pay. And we'll get into that a little bit more when I talk about ratings and what ratings tell you and what they're trying to express. But basically, infrastructure is long-term. You can have hiccups. You can have times when you have a failure to pay, but the recovery of the payments, once missed, is very high. So it's a safe investment for the long term. It has a steady stream of payments on a regular basis, and even when there are problems, you usually recover from those problems and get paid in full over the life of the project. That is not the case with equity investments necessarily. Now, for all the reasons why debt to infrastructure is safe, it also means the safety to equity investment is quite high. It's quite good. They still have this monopoly position. They still are there for the long term, usually have government support. They're going to pay or recover, but you don't have that steady stream guaranteed. You have more reasons to be worried about the equity, particularly as projects are getting to be very highly leveraged. The more debt you have relative to equity, the more risk you're running. And increasingly, projects have a tendency to move to higher leverage because it gives the equity a better return. So be very careful. There's a big difference in debt and equity. Well, I'm getting some water. Do we have any comments or questions? Rebuttals? Okay. I warn you, if you don't start interacting, I'll just talk and talk and talk. Until maybe my voice gives out or we run out of time. I just learned how to do animation on slides, so watch, you'll see some animations here. Okay, advantages. You can read in a lot of the marketing materials on people who are talking about the advantages of infrastructure and investing. What are the advantages? Well, asset liability matching is one of the real advantages. Pension funds and insurance companies have long-term liabilities. They need to match it with long-term assets. It's to their advantage to do that. Now, that's in general. There's a big difference between a pension fund that is a defined benefit fund and a defined contribution fund. And those of you who are from the pension fund community of Columbia, you're probably in a defined contribution fund structure, and you know that you need liquidity. You don't have a long-term, fully committed asset base in total. You need liquidity. Whereas if you're a Michigan Municipal Employees Retirement Fund, you know very well what's going to happen in the future. Because the money is there for you to invest for the retirees. You have good information about, sort of statistical information about the outflows from your fund. You don't worry very much about liquidity at all. And then you can really focus on asset liability matching. Now, even in the North America and in Europe, this is a new trend among pension funds and even insurance companies, although insurance companies have always been much more conscious of asset liability management, particularly life insurance companies, and those are the major ones that are the long-term investors. There was a lot of focus on getting as much return for your investments as possible, maximizing return without taking too much risk. And that was sort of the mantra of investing. How high of a return can I get without passing some level of riskiness? That is changing now, and there's beginning to be more of an emphasis, because that's a short-term focus. That can only be a short-term focus because you look at your performance on a day-to-day basis or a year-by-year basis. And that is important, and I'm sure it's important to the pension funds in Colombia because people can move their pensions so easily between various pension plans, and they probably do it on the basis of returns only. But for a healthy pension plan or a healthy insurance company, in the long run, it is best to focus on long-term asset liability management. And that is beginning to be the standard now increasingly. And because of that, if you're trying to do that type of matching, there are not that many assets that have the long-term characteristics that you're seeking. That is, they're safe and they're long-term. Infrastructure is one of those asset classes. Probably the ideal asset class for asset liability matching. Predictable inflation-adjusted returns. That's very important to you. Inflation can erode everyone's assets, and so having inflation protection is quite important. And there are very few instruments in most countries to have long-term inflation protection. A few governments will offer bonds that are linked to inflation, but very few governments do that, and usually the supply is not nearly adequate to the demands of the institutional investors. So one of the really positive things about infrastructure is that often, for example, in toll roads, you have a structure where you know your revenues are going to be linked to inflation either directly or indirectly. So if you invest in an asset that is tied, the revenue is tied to inflation, you have this protection. And there are very few asset classes that offer that other than infrastructure. So that makes infrastructure quite attractive. Risk and liquidity premiums. In many cases, infrastructure is only slightly riskier than government debt. Why? Because in part, most of the infrastructure you will be looking at is largely based on governments making availability payments, or at least covering some of the revenue through availability payments. The government, in many cases, is supporting the infrastructure projects and protecting them and structuring them to be attractive to you. So, in a sense, it's only a small increase in risk compared to government debt, which you view as zero risk, your own government's debt. And yet the returns are quite substantial compared to the increase in risk. So the risk-return characteristics are very good. And so you have a good risk premium for the risk that you're actually taking. And also, if you do invest for the long term, you are a rare source of financing, and you can earn a liquidity premium, which often can be 100 basis points. Now that varies tremendously according to market conditions and to countries, but if you are, I think like here in Colombia, one of the few providers of long-term debt to a project, so they don't have to worry about refinancing at some point or any kind of short-term changes in the market, you can charge for locking in and providing that long-term financing. So in general, infrastructure shows that it's a very good risk return and liquidity premium generator. Stable credit profile. This is quite important because usually in most countries, institutional investors have a lot of regulations about what can be in their portfolio. So they normally stay to the very low-risk assets. Well, some assets can start out as low risk and become high risk overnight almost. Corporate bonds are sort of in that category, although they don't vary that much. But corporate bonds you can buy today, say at a AA, and 5 years from now the company's business strategy or market conditions have changed and it's down to a BBB or a BB, and you have a problem. That has an impact on your financing and your portfolio, and sometimes you'll have to get rid of those assets. And you probably will have to get rid of them into a market that doesn't want them, so that you're going to lose money on that. So you want to have assets that are stable in terms of their credit profile. Infrastructure debt has proven to be very stable. In fact, if you take the universe of rated, credit rating agency rated infrastructure debt, and look at its performance during the recent global financial crisis. On average, the largest change in rating was 1 notch. Now that's going from, say, from a BBB plus to a BBB, or a BBB to a BBB minus. 1 notch change in one of the largest financial shocks the world has had in recent years. 1 notch change. Most infrastructure debt actually improves in credit quality over time. Particularly once you get through the construction phase and a project is operating, normally you have a sharp uptick in the credit rating or the credit quality. And it can continue to get better credit quality over time. So that is a very important protection for institutional investors, is a stability in the credit profile. Risk diversification. Now you know basic portfolio theory says this is the free lunch. If you want to have a better portfolio, diversify. You'll have more stable, better returns. But what does diversification mean? Just by buying something that's labeled differently, or say buying DuPont stock now and buying GM, that's not necessarily diversification if GM and DuPont stock move together. So that's the correlation of their movements. There have been a lot of studies about the correlation between asset classes, and it always comes across that infrastructure has a low correlation to most other asset classes and a low correlation to macroeconomic cycles. Like I was saying, the global financial crisis, the recession, it didn't have much of an impact on infrastructure debt returns. Shouldn't have had. There weren't many defaults, which was the only event you worry about. The performance was still there. So you have true diversification because you have very low correlation between this asset class and the others that you have in your portfolio, stocks and government bonds and so forth. So that's an advantage to you. Substantial pipeline. Colombia has a substantial pipeline. There's no other country in the world that if you ask their institutional investors, do you have the pipeline of infrastructure projects that you need, that they will say yes. There was recently a major survey in Australia of the, what they call in Australia, they call them superannuation funds, which are their pension funds. What is the biggest impediment to you of investing in infrastructure? They said the pipeline is insufficient. Now what that means is they know that getting into infrastructure, they have to overcome a lot of barriers. They have to do a lot to get into the infrastructure asset class. And it won't pay them to do that unless there are projects for them to invest in. And their complaint, and it's a complaint you hear in Canada as well, in Europe as well, but to lesser degrees, you don't hear it much in the UK, is that there isn't a pipeline of such projects. And that's for several reasons. In the case of Australia and Canada, is because infrastructure, basic infrastructure there is not a national government effort, it's a provincial or state effort. So it's decentralized. And so there's no centralized planning of an infrastructure effort and a pipeline, and we're going to figure out what we need and we're going to see that it's done. It just doesn't happen in Australia. Now, it does happen in the UK. The central government, the UK Treasury. Is this thing going on and on? Okay, maybe I'm doing something. I'm probably talking loud enough. I hope everybody can hear. In the UK, the government is in charge, essentially, of the pipeline of PFI, PPP projects, that is, government availability and payment sponsored projects. And they make a real effort, and they have for some time, to predict out the pipeline. But Colombia has the most substantial pipeline of infrastructure projects in the world, in terms of numbers, value, quality of structure. And it has this for a couple of reasons. One is, I think you should credit your government of being forward-thinking and realizing it needs to lay out what needs to be done and make sure that the institutions are in place to see that it's done. But it's also because you're catching up. Unfortunately, you had a history of a long period when you did not invest in infrastructure. It put you way behind your competitors. It's a major impediment for Colombia's future growth. Transport costs are outrageously high. You have rich natural resources, you have manufacturing, you have agriculture, but it's not nearly as competitive as it can be because you don't have the highways, the ports, the facilities to transport these goods. The government's is addressing that problem. They've developed a pipeline, and they made that pipeline very transparent. They've set up institutions like A&I to structure the projects to meet the needs of the investors. They've added on top of that FDN to make sure that some of the possible financial impediments can be overcome. They go beyond just structuring. And this is why I said at the very beginning, I'm very optimistic that Colombia is getting to be known and is going to become very well known, particularly if you're successful in making this work, because you're at the cutting edge of what is happening today in the infrastructure field. Now, this last one is a very controversial one, socially responsible investing. And I think any investment manager of a pension fund or an insurance company would be very clear that they don't want to be told where to invest by the government, that they don't invest with an eye toward being socially responsible per se. They don't try to be socially irresponsible, but they don't make that as an investment criteria usually. But think of the following. Colombia, most of your investments are tied to the Colombian economy. Now, what's going to make the Colombian economy do better, and therefore for you to get a better return on your stocks and bonds and everything that you've invested in? Infrastructure. What is needed to make that happen is for institutional investors to provide the financing to make those infrastructure projects possible. And if you do that, and you have a long-term horizon in your thinking, is that purely socially responsible investing, or is it just smart investing for your own self-interest? It's both. It's what your country needs. It is socially responsible, but it also is good investment in the long term because you're helping to overcome an impediment. My favorite example is the story of Finland in the 20th century. Finland today is known to be one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. It has companies like Nokia and others. Highest level of educational achievement in the world. Almost all tests of high school students, Finland comes out first. It's viewed as a very advanced country today. In 1900, it was the poorest, most backward country of Europe. It was a rural economy on the periphery in a bad climate. Everything was against Finland. And it included they had Russia as their neighbor, which kept invading them. So everything was against Finland. Well, how did Finland in one century move from that position to where it is today? largely because the government did two things. They introduced a pre-funded pension system. And they did it with the farmers, with very, very small payments by the farmers, made at their local post office, handwritten scripts, recorded, going into pension systems. Those pension systems really had nothing to invest in until the government said, maybe they were looking at Russia, where the motto back in the old communist days was electrification is communism. They said, we have to have electricity throughout this country if we're going to catch up. And so they created an infrastructure development program, and they asked the pension funds, in fact they sort of told the pension funds, you're going to finance it, and they did. They electrified all of Finland to build the generation, the hydropower plants, the distribution system with pension fund money. And then they said, now we have to have, this was by the 1930s, they would say, now we have to have manufacturing. So they encouraged them to invest in the infrastructure of manufacturing and transportation, and they did. And this is what brought Finland from the most backward country in Europe to a leading country in Europe, when everything was against them. It was the pension funds being mobilized for investment, which the pension funds in Finland are doing very well. They pay very good pensions there. They had a tremendous growth in their asset base. They had their ups and downs because of the history of the 20th century with a few wars. But it is one of these success stories of that long-term attitude. Now, governments are pushing institutional investors to be socially responsible, to do the long-term investment, but it's wise investment too. So I think it is something that should be on the list. Okay, that's the sales job. Now you're all convinced, right? You're going to rush out and you're going to invest in infrastructure tomorrow. Well, here's where the hard part begins. It would be great if it was easy to invest in infrastructure. Unfortunately, it is not. Why? Yes?
So, could you elaborate a little bit more regarding the 100 basic points of liquidity premium? Because I understand that globally, if you invest in this kind of assets, you have that. But in Colombia, could you ask a little bit more than that 100 basic points of the Colombian case?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, it varies a lot by market conditions and by country, sort of the institutionals. The logic of it is, if you are financing an infrastructure project, for example, it's cheapest if you can get money from day one that lasts through the entire project. So you don't have, for example, to refinance at some point, which could be a costly exercise. So if you have investors who are willing to say, I will put the money in and I'll buy and hold, I'm not going to trade it, I'm there. Or even if you could have a secondary market where they could trade, but you can count on the investors buying it for a long term, say 30-year bonds. And now there are infrastructure bonds that are 60 years, 70 years in some countries. So there are very few investors that can provide that. And so it's basic economics. Scarcity of supply, significant demand coming from infrastructure means that you can say, if you want my financing, there's a premium to it, the liquidity premium, my willingness to lock the money in. Now that should always be there, but it depends upon market conditions. It depends upon that supply and demand for one thing, and it depends upon institutions too, as whether or not this is a standard part of the negotiations in terms of the pricing of the debt. Now you do have the reality that when you're doing a project, bank debt usually looks the most expensive. Whereas the pension fund financing is usually attractive because it's at lower cost. Now, it can be at lower cost but still have a liquidity premium in there. And that's what is hard sometimes to break out, how much of that is simply a liquidity premium. But there have been a number of academic studies that have tried to say, are you getting a premium by being willing to lock in for long term and financing infrastructure projects? And the answer is, in most cases, yes. And efforts to measure it, it's been in the range around a mean of about 100 basis points. Whether or not that will become a standard, say, in Colombia, It's partly your negotiating skills, I would think, as an institution with the project sponsors. Now, it also has to do with the project sponsors' attitude themselves. Now, I find it very surprising sometimes how people borrow money. The most surprising is cross-border borrowing. The thought that, well, I have a choice between borrowing in Colombia at 10% and borrowing in North America at 5%. And so I'll go dollar borrowing 5%. Every month, you can read in the newspaper about some country like Hungary where there was a borrowing spree, say for home mortgages, in Swiss francs because Swiss francs were so cheap, and they have lived to regret it, particularly this week after what the Swiss central bank did. People have a tendency to absolutely ignore those types of risks, even project sponsors. And I find it surprising that there's so much cross-border, cross-currency borrowing that is unhedged that people think they can do safely, and then they regret it later. And this has really been a problem for infrastructure, where a lot of, say, developing countries for a long time have borrowed from European banks unhedged because they can't hedge on their own currency over the long term, and have ended up paying much, much more over the life of the projects than if they had simply borrowed at home at high interest rates. And it happens over and over and over again. So you can't get around the fact that sometimes market participants are very short-sighted. Another example is refinancing risk. Now, you're being able to earn a liquidity premium because you're willing to finance, say, from day one to the end of a project. Part of that is because you've taken out refinancing risk. But you have project sponsors who say, oh, that's 7 years from now. And the market, may be up or down, but the project should be better, it's operating. We'll be able to refinance, we'll get a better refinancing. We don't have to buy any kind of protection against that. And we're not going to pay some pension fund an extra 100 basis points because they'll provide financing that takes us over that. So it depends. But I think increasingly project sponsors are getting more aware of the risk that they take on refinancing. They're aware of already, I think, of the exchange rate risk. And there is substantial capability of protecting against that in many countries for many currencies, but not all. But you really should keep putting that forward. There is a liquidity premium here that we expect to earn. That's why this is what we're charging you. Be aware that you're going to save money because you don't have these refinancing events occurring periodically, that you have a stability in your financing that is known. And so perhaps a liquidity premium of 100 basis point can be achieved in Colombia. Okay? Thank you for your question. This is a really big impediment. Projects are complex. Try reading the legal documentation. Oh, it's the best thing to put you to sleep. It's not only are they complex, but there's been no standardization, unfortunately. So every project is unique. You can't assume anything. So it makes it tedious. A lot of the risks are difficult to understand and really require experience. That you really don't have a sensitivity to the risk or how to deal with them unless you've done it before or faced it before. So this is your first impediment. Do you have in your investment team the people who can evaluate project finance? And most institutional investors, particularly if they're just starting out in the asset class, and just think if it's only 1% of your portfolio, how many of your people can you justify focusing or gaining experience in this asset class? That's a huge impediment. We'll talk about how do you get around that impediment. There are ways, but it is sort of the first and very important impediment. Secondly, and I've already mentioned this is a new frontier. There is some empirical evidence on performance of infrastructure investments, But it's all equity. We're talking about debt. There is almost no empirical information to guide you, to prove to you that this is a great investment. That is being built today. There are logical reasons to think it's a great investment, but it is untested. And along with that is, where's your benchmark? You know, normally an investment manager in every asset class will have some benchmark that they will use, particularly if they're using outside managers. But even if they're just having their own staff do anything, they need a guide. You know, what should Jose be getting in return for what he's doing on infrastructure in terms of his performance bonus for the company? You know, is he doing good? Is he doing bad? I don't know, because I have no benchmark to guide by. So that's an impediment, not having the empirical record, not having a benchmark. This is a major issue too, particularly pension funds. I think when I started looking at Colombia, I was really worried about, well, how, I read about, you know, your recent reform that sort of in a sense increased ability to people to move around, that you have a system already where people can move around. Can you afford to have illiquid assets in your portfolio? And the answer is, it depends. If you're a small pension fund, maybe not. But if you're large pension funds and you have an extremely concentrated pension fund industry, and you have some big pension funds by international standards, you can, because there's a core amount of your assets that don't have to be liquid. So let infrastructure provide part of that core. You do maybe need liquidity on the margin. You will have fluctuations and redemptions or movements and so forth. But it's on the margin, and if you're large pension funds, and that's what you have here in Colombia, you can deal with them. The best example is Australia. And in fact, I will talk a lot about Australia. In bringing to Colombia the examples of what you should think about, Australia is prime. The reason is they have defined contribution pension funds, these supers they have, defined contribution. They're not defined benefit. They have been investing in infrastructure for a long time, because Australia, you know, is sort of a new frontier country with lots of space, need for a lot of roads, and so there's been a lot of infrastructure development, even though it was run by the states of Australia and not a great pipeline. There's been a lot of infrastructure. So they have a lot of experience, and they've gone through a process. They've evolved a great deal in how they invest in infrastructure, and there are a lot of lessons from Australia for Colombia because they are also defined contribution. The other country that you often turn to for examples of what to do is Canada. But unfortunately, almost all of the Canadian pension funds are defined contribution pension funds. And they're very large. There are a lot of them, and a lot of very large ones, and they have unique investment capabilities, some of which Colombia can learn from. But they are fundamentally different. The Australians are the ones you should turn to and look at and learn from. But the liquidity, I think, is not such a great problem if you're large enough, if you have a large enough body of assets. And I think Colombia, most institutional investors are fairly large by international standards. You should look at the United States. You know, our pension funds there are so fragmented. We have pension funds for the teachers of Minnesota. We have pension funds for the municipal employees of Michigan. That's one of the big ones. I mean, they're broken down in ways because of history that keep them fairly small. We have, of course, CalPERS and CalSTRS and teachers and a few others like this that are really huge, some of the largest in the world. But the majority of our pension funds are small, and a lot of them are now defined contribution. It's only the public funds, the public employees or the teachers who are quasi-public employees that have defined benefit pension funds anymore. Companies don't. They've gone to defined contribution. So it's a little harder for these smaller U.S. funds to get into infrastructure, and they don't. Negative carry issues. This is a technical issue. It does not always apply. It applies primarily when a pension fund wants to get into financing projects through buying bonds that are issued. That faces a technical problem called negative carry. When you issue bonds publicly, you usually have to have a fairly large size issuance. There's a threshold. And for a project, that threshold is sort of what the project needs for debt. So they raise all the money on day one if they're going to use it for financing the construction phase. They don't need that money on day one. They have to issue the bond to get the money, but then the money is going to sit there. And it can be invested in government securities or something safe, but it's a drag because they're not going to have the returns that you're seeking because you're investing at lower returns until the money is utilized. And because the money is utilized over time, you have what they call negative carry. With the banks will provide financing for construction and they disperse as needed, so you don't have a negative carry problem. There are ways of getting around negative carry, some better, some worse. You can have a guaranteed investment contract, that is simply where the returns are guaranteed to be better because you can take those assets and invest them in a way safely but with a higher return. And that has been used quite a bit in the United States and in Europe. GICs, they have their problems. But in reality, negative carry is really only a problem during financing for construction. Financing for construction is a short period of time compared to the life of the project. Say 5 years for 25-year projects. And while this adds to the cost of the financing, if you amortize that cost over the remaining 20 years, it's not much. It's very small. It may look at, in terms of volume to be a large cost, but think of it in terms of the entire financing period, it diminishes greatly. And really, what most countries are aiming for is to try to get institutional investors to come in at day one, finance projects, and hold it through the life of the project. So in those cases, certainly that little negative carry is not going to be a big problem. Is that someone asking a question? Oh, it's my echo. It is. Let me just talk about it. Am I carrying in the back of the room? I think the echo is more evaluation. The microphone, okay. Uh-oh, there's something in the system maybe. I think I turned this off. Do we have any tech people in the room? Thank you, George. Is the echo still there? Let me turn the microphone on. Yes, there's an echo. When I talk, so you see the echo? Let's see. It's having a feedback of some kind. I turned that one off, I think. It just started. I'll use this, but we still have to take it there. Test. You still have a delay.
Yeah.
Let's not dwell on a technical issue like negative carry. It is an issue. It's fun to talk about. It can be dealt with. It's sometimes overplayed, I think. This is an issue that is not recognized very much. And I want to pound it in. I'm sure all the infrastructure managers that are managing funds will appreciate this. because this is what you are providing as much as anything else when you're investing in infrastructure debt. You're investing in debt is not like investing in equity where you sort of have to be involved in many, many different ways in terms of getting a good return. And you're taking risk and you're having to make calculations. With debt, it's a contract to be paid. All you really need to make sure is that that contract will be fulfilled. Now, that takes analysis. It takes risk analysis. It takes credit analysis. It takes detailed analysis of the structure. But in general, you're being paid for a service you're providing, and a large part of the service is project management and control. And unfortunately, a lot of investors who have never tried to invest or manage an infrastructure investment do not realize what a job that is. Is there an echo?
No.
Great, thank you. Now, I haven't said anything about my background. I think that you might have seen my CV. I think it was maybe distributed with the invitation. But I'll just use this. This is fine. Yeah. My last job that required me to go to New York and work was with Ambac Assurance Corporation, one of the big monolines. In fact, the first one in the industry. And even we at Ambac, when we sold ourselves to investors, when we guaranteed payment on bonds, we sold primarily our credit enhancement. That we protect you from defaults. That if the bond issuer fails to pay, we will step in, make sure that you get payment, and you can rely on us, and we're AAA and all that. We made very little effort to tell them where a lot of the work went. And the work went in two areas. First, structuring projects so that we were willing to offer a financial guarantee. That is, making sure that projects were properly structured, that there was little risk to them because they were structured well. That's a lot of work, a lot of due diligence. And then after that, after the bonds were issued, it wasn't just that we were going to make payment if they didn't get payment from the issuer. We tried to make sure that there was never an incident of that happening by constantly managing and being on top of projects. And that is not so important when you're doing things like municipal bonds. It is important. The bulk of Ambac's work was municipal bonds. But we were also doing toll roads in Chile. And when you're doing an infrastructure project, you have a very complex contractual relationship among many different parties. And because you can't see the future perfectly and you always make mistakes, there are constant stream of waivers, consents, restructuring, refinancing activities going on. It's not a passive role. So Ambac was not sitting there simply saying, we will pay you if they don't send you the check, and we just wait to see if that happens. We had to respond whenever there was a need for a waiver on some terms on a contract. We had to step in sometimes and take over control and replace a subcontractor. Now, we did that because when we guaranteed Chilean toll road bonds, we provided a complete credit protection on the entire issue. And while at first there was argument about what that meant in terms of control, we insisted that since we were taking all the credit risk, we took all the control rights. And that the institutional investors were truly passive investors. They did not have to worry about the day-to-day management because they were not in control. Now, most of the ways that you will be investing in infrastructure, you're going to be worried about control issues. You may have an intermediary helping you, but you're still going to have to learn a lot about how to manage a project financing after, say, the debt has been put in. That can be done very poorly, that can be done very well. You should do it very well for your own protection. If you do it poorly, you're more likely to have a default. If you don't have some Ambac there standing saying that we're going to pay regardless, then you're going to take a hit. This is what you're going to be paying intermediaries for, probably. And if you decide that you want to do it in-house, this is why you need staff. A fairly substantial human resources commitment to get experienced people on a full-time basis to manage project finance. And also, when you're looking at the rewards or the returns for investing in projects, you need to factor in this is a cost. You're not a passive investor when you get into infrastructure. You shouldn't be, no matter how you get into it. There is more passivity in certain types of investments than others, but this is a very important issue. And if you use an intermediary, like an infrastructure debt investment fund manager, this is largely what you're going to be paying them for. And then regulatory issues. And this is really one where, as you in Colombia start looking at lessons in other countries and want to apply them into your country, you're probably going to run into issues because your regulations are so different from other countries. Most other countries like Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe, the United States, institutional investors are lightly regulated, their investment decisions. You're not restricted very much in how you invest. You have certain requirements, certain responsibilities, legal responsibilities, but you're not told in very explicit terms what you can and cannot invest in and how much you can invest in. In Colombia, you do. And that is going to shape what kinds of instruments you use and how you use them. And I am not an expert on your regulatory structure. In the last year and a half, I've learned a little bit, but I'll tell you, I keep wondering, how does this work? What does this mean? And so that's going to be a big issue, is how it's not that your regulatory structure is bad or preventing you from investing in infrastructure. Not at all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that as you adopt, say, lessons from other places, you might run into regulatory issues, say, well, you can't do that way. So you're going to have to find something else to do. For example, negative carry. One of the solutions that has been found is to have advanced purchase contracts. That is, from day one during the construction period, there's a contract with pension funds or insurance companies to disperse at certain milestones or certain dates. Well, until recently, I understand in Colombia you couldn't do that in pension funds. Now there's been an exception that you can do that under certain circumstances, like through an investment management firm. But these things have to be kept in mind. So now we've gone through why you want to get into infrastructure, why it's going to be difficult. On balance, I say it's worth it, even though you have these difficulties. But how do you go about it is next. Now, this is my own list of ways that you can go about it. This is probably people have other approaches to this, but let me just go through what I think are the key ways. Direct investing. How many pension funds in the world truly do direct investing? I have read as maybe 10. Most of them in Canada. Okay? Direct investing means you are complete charge. You have all the responsibility, you make decisions, and you make the investments. It's not that you're direct investing and not investing anything. That's how you do it. A lot of pension funds are direct investing with zero investments. But if you are a large Canadian pension fund, this can be attractive. Some of the European pension funds are doing this, in the Netherlands, for example. The classic example is OMERS, the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System, one of the world's big pension funds, a defined benefit pension fund. And years ago, they started investing in primarily Canadian infrastructure. Now they invest globally. They set up their own company. They started internally, then they set up their own company that is dedicated to them and their investment needs. But now it's so big and successful that they hire out their services to other institutional investors and makes money for the Ontario Pension Fund. Well, direct investing is very attractive because it's probably the lowest cost way of investing if you really do it at the right scale. That is, that you have the adequate capabilities and pay for them, but you have then the adequate investments to give you the returns. It gives you very low cost of investing. And more importantly, you don't have to worry about alignment of interest between you and some other entity that serves as a vehicle for you to invest. You're doing it in-house. There's no principal and agent issue involved. You have a full alignment of interest. So it's attractive, and I would say that some of the big institutional investors here in Colombia will someday probably do this. Because you are of that size. I mean, you are large enough to where you could probably do this, but maybe that's not the best place to start. The starting point is usually infrastructure debt funds. You have, I understand, 4 in the process of getting started here in Colombia that are Colombian-based. You have quite a few international ones. I think we'll focus on the Colombia-based ones, and we have representatives, I think, in the audience for most of them. They are providing a service. They are the ones who, on your behalf, you give them an allocation of your assets. They look for opportunities, which means they should have good relationships with the infrastructure companies and with the banks, because in many cases it'll be co-financing. They're probably going to be investing here in Colombia, directly loans together with the banking community. They're the ones who have to be involved from day one in setting up the financial structure. They can make the commitments of the debt of a number of institutional investors, which is a very important aspect of this, because any institutional investor who wants to go in directly is going to have tremendous risk because of lack of diversification in their portfolio as they're building the portfolio. Whereas a manager for a number of pension funds can start off faster, build faster, have more diversification, so you have that benefit. But they're really going to earn their money by the control on a day-to-day basis. They do the waivers, consents, they do the reporting. And I think the model here in Colombia that is the most promising one is that they are the bridge to direct investing and to investing in other ways. You invest in one of these managers, if they do their job, they not only will take care of the control issues, but they will teach you. They will provide reporting on what they do. You have staff who read those reports.
How should you understand diversification in the context of a single sector, single country fund?
We don't have as much diversification, certainly. And that's going to be an issue, because not only will these 4 funds that are being funded here probably be heavy into the 4G toll roads, they're going to be exclusively Colombia, and that's not the kind of diversification you would like to have ideally, but it's the first step. That's an important you've got to start. You're going to be undiversified no matter what your plan is, you're initially going to be undiversified. I think the risk is that in Colombia, you're probably going to get a lot of investments made and still be undiversified just because of your pipeline that you have here. Now, there is the other route, and that is if some of the international debt funds take an interest in Colombia, which I think they will, but not maybe in the next couple of years. I think they're all sort of waiting to see what happens with this initial few rounds of projects. But if these prove to be good projects, perform well, people have confidence in them, then the major international firms, where you will have various ways that you combine the assets of Canada, Japan, Europe, the United States, and invest in projects around the world. And a lot of the infrastructure funds are of that type. And most of them say we'll only invest in OECD countries or only invest in Europe, things like that. But there are a few now are global. And some of these global funds will have some infrastructure in even what we call emerging markets, and Colombia is called an emerging market. I think that would be a big step forward when they start doing that. And I don't think these funds are concerned about the fact that they will be taking exchange rate risk if they do it in Colombian pesos. In fact, you find increasingly institutional investors want to build a diversified international portfolio both in terms of credits and currencies. And they deliberately don't hedge because they want a diversified portfolio of currencies. But this takes a really big fund with really good diversification and management. There are a few of those, but they're still in their infancy. And they will come to Colombia someday, but I think what you're going to start with the 4 that you have here, or maybe not all 4, we'll have to see, and they will not be highly diversified by sector, and certainly not by country first. But that's, up the staircase to what you want to achieve. And you do want to have international diversification and sectoral diversification and type of greenfield, brownfield projects, combinations. You don't want to have all availability payments. You want to take some market risks so you can get higher returns, so you get outside of the PPP sphere of projects. And then you get a really diverse portfolio, and those are probably the ones that will perform best over the long term. But that's a good point about the lack of diversification initially. But infrastructure debt funds have a lot of advantages. Their history is one where they were widely embraced initially, and initially being, let's say, not earlier than 20 years ago, but more like 10 years ago. And then the institutional investors began to criticize them on two grounds primarily. They were expensive, and that's changing, because they were way too expensive initially for the risk they were taking. They were taking a model from equity investing and charging what's called the 2 in 20 model, where it was a 2% of asset per year fee and a 20% of the carry, the interest carry, which is sort of the end of a certain period of time, the return greater than some benchmark. Like if the returns were over 8% over the whole period of the investment, they took 20% of the excess earnings. Well, that ended up being, and that was the model that was the average for pure equity investment, not even infrastructure, just pure equity. And pure equity investing is an expensive and sometimes well worthy, because you can get very good returns if you have good investors and you pay them supposedly to give you good returns, although it's hard to know who's going to make the good investments. And they just adopted that model, and that was too expensive. And that is, I think, has been corrected. I think increasingly there has been a movement to the view that I'm trying to express here, that what you're paying these funds for is not to take risk, but to manage your investment. And therefore, the returns do not have to be as high, because it's sort of a certain kind of job, you're paying for a service, and more than likely you want to focus on the fee based upon the assets under management in some way, and not a performance bonus, because there's very little in the debt area that you can do to get a higher return. You have a contracted return. Now, in your choice of projects and you're avoiding defaults and your remediation efforts, that will affect your return. So that maybe there should be some performance, but it's not like what you have in equity. So the formula has to be different. Now that is changing. It changed radically in Australia. It's changing in other areas. The Australians were sort of the leaders in this whole area of debt, infrastructure, and equity funds, and they've gone through a transition in their model. The other and more difficult problem was alignment of interest. You have a principal-agent problem, of course, because you are providing money to someone else to invest on your behalf, and how they benefit and how you benefit, you've got to be very careful about making there as aligned as possible. And there were a lot of mistakes made in that area of alignment. For example, the early funds in Australia were closed-in funds that were structured in a way that what the managers ended up doing was focusing on the performance bonus they were going to get, and therefore taking more risk than they should have. And they paid for that, particularly when the global financial crisis hit. A lot of these funds did very poorly. And they were mainly equity funds anyway. In addition to that, you have the horizon that they were investing on. A lot of these funds were structured, small teams of people, very specialized people, and knowledgeable people, and for them to get the big payoff, they wanted to get it in a reasonable period of time. So these were not only closed-in funds, but they were closed in with a 5 or 7 year horizon. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense when you're dealing with an asset class that has a 25-year horizon to do it with a closed-in fund with a 5-year horizon. But that's sort of how the fund managers, that's what they offered, and they were taken up. And lo and behold, it ended up with them taking decisions that were not in the interest of the pension funds who wanted to invest on a long-term basis and get the benefits of that. So that was another problem. And additionally, they were allowed to continue to raise capital, which they ended up doing, continuing increasing in the assets under management just deliberately to get the higher fees, and in fact paying the investors out of that, and it was an unsustainable model over the life of the fund, and that came home to roost and didn't work very well. So there was a lack of attention to this need to carefully align interest. And I think that here in Colombia, this is going to be the critical issue for the funds and the institutional investors, to make sure you really sit down and make sure you're both on the same page. Now, what I hear from talking to a couple of the management firms and from the FD and staff who've talked to all of them is that that is being done better here. You are using closed-in funds, but you have a long horizon. 20-year funds or 25 years. That's more appropriate. And the fee structure is more in line with less performance fee and more of paying you for the service, the day-to-day service of managing projects, structuring, managing, and remediating, and so forth. And that's very encouraging. And I think that that's what you should have, because that's what other countries have learned they have to have. And the final thing is this being a stepping stone to direct investment. Yes?
Just one question. In your experience, you know, this management fee that you pay to the funds, it is related to the performance of the underlying portfolio? I mean, if the proportion of the loans is not current and you have some kind of default, it is usual to punish the economics of the fund, or do you pay no matter what, no matter how high the default rate of the fund is?
Well, there's two types of the fees I talked about. Is a standard sort of steady fee, pay for service, steady service, and then some fee for performance. Now, there's nothing wrong about having some payment for performance if it's structured properly. If you're going to do that with a debt fund, think about, well, what are the benchmarks of good performance? One would be finding projects and getting money into them. That's not easy. You've got to be able to, act quickly, structure, get things well set up, and get the investors' money in. Achieving that, even though maybe the investors aren't actually putting money in until you have the investments, still you want to be good at that, and maybe you want to have a performance bonus tied to that. More importantly, probably, is if there are any key events that happen, like replacement of subcontractors, which can be very time-consuming and difficult, and if they are successful in doing that, not disturbing the performance of the payment stream, maybe having a performance bonus on that, going to the end of the project and terminating and so forth, or if there's early termination, of course, being involved to make sure that they're protecting the senior creditors who've invested, they do a good job on that. It's more difficult to structure. You have to get into the nitty-gritty of what do you pay them for good performance, how do you measure good performance, and how you pay them. There's very little experience. You're going to be pioneers in this area. My major point is pay attention to it. That's one of the most important things, is to get an alignment of interest, realize that debt is not equity, don't accept an equity type model at all, just reject it, say it's irrelevant, I don't care what they pay over there. If you're doing debt, you're doing something very different, and you designed the new model. There will be the Colombia model, I think, at some point, because you're the ones that are sort of starting from scratch and can do it right. You don't have a lot of baggage to carry around. And from what I hear, you're doing it right. That's the feedback I'm getting, is that you're looking at these issues. Okay? I actually had a scary graph that I will not show you. Clementi didn't want me to show you because it could be misleading. A major academic study of the difference between pension funds, returns, and risk when they were investing directly or through infrastructure funds. Now these were equity funds, and it was just night and day. They lost their shirts going through the equity funds. They had very good returns if they did a direct investment. It's highly skewed, of course, to those omers of the world who are good at this and have done it for a while because that was the sample they had to deal with. And probably the bad results were the more recently implemented models, and it was equity. And so it's irrelevant. I'm not going to show it. It would be something that says, don't go through a fund, go direct. But that's not the message. The message is, go direct when you're able to go direct, maybe. And use the funds to be your trainers. Now, in reality, you only have a certain pool of expertise anywhere, and particularly in Colombia. And you have to have expertise. You have to have people who know finance, who know engineering, who know the asset class, and usually have to have a lot of experience. And those are scarce people, and they're expensive people. And it's, in a sense, better, I think, for the institutional investors to say, let's concentrate in getting 2, 3, or 4 teams of such people together and representing our interest that way. It almost becomes another model. Let's skip over this. Pool financing platforms. There's a lot of discussion these days about this pool financing platforms, and there are various models of how to do that. But I would say in Colombia, you're almost moving to that because you have an interesting situation of just a few institutional investors and a few managers. It's not like you have in other larger countries where there's a lot of competition, a lot of different investors. And even if you're using these fund managers, if you focus on this alignment of interest and they're new and they're open to being built correctly, and they view seriously that they are an intermediary at least for a period, probably they'll stay there for the smaller funds later. But some of the bigger investors, they'll stay with the smaller investors forever because they'll never have the resources to do it in-house. They'll want to get into infrastructure. But some of the larger institutional investors will move into direct investing. And you're almost doing what in England they're doing with what's called the pension infrastructure platform. The government encouraged this, but it's purely done by the pension funds. They got together a number of pension funds. Each pension fund had to commit £100 million, I think. They organized this pool